We're looking at where in Scripture we can find the gospel in addition to John 3:16. We do this to encourage you in your faith and to give you additional tools as you witness to family and friends. The message is always the same, but depending on who is speaking and who the audience is, a different approach can be taken. But again, the message is always the same. Today we are in the Old Testament, and we're going to look at the book of Daniel. Now, I have mentioned Daniel chapter 7 before when we looked at the Gospel of Mark. And this is a presentation of the Messiah, the Son of Man, the Son of God, in chapter 7. Now, we're going to get to it, but again, let's take a longer look here at the book of Daniel. The theme of Daniel is God's sovereignty over the kings and kingdoms of the world. God is sovereign over the kings and kingdoms of the world. Daniel is a very curious book. There are some very unique things about Daniel. It stands out. We find Daniel after the first three, the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. We have Daniel, and then we get the 12 minor prophets. Now, I know in a previous episode I said 9, and I misspoke. And yet, neither Jewish nor evangelical Christian scholars really consider Daniel to be a prophet. He does interpret dreams, he has visions, and some of those include future things, but he's not really in the office of prophet. Just go back here a little bit in history. At the end of the time of Judges, when the people of Israel really wanted a king, and God gave them the first king, which was Saul, later David, and his son Solomon. At that same time, God raised up prophets, people that would speak for God. And the office or the role of the prophet was to speak for God to the kings and to the people. So we had the greater kingdom, and then that was split up. The 10 tribes in the north became the northern nation, then that was Israel. They were later conquered by the Assyrians and carried away in 722 BC, and we often refer to them as the lost 10 tribes. And of course, Judah and Reuben were in the south, and that became the nation of Judah, with capital city being, of course, Jerusalem. And so we have all of these prophets that are raised up. So, for instance, when David committed adultery with Bathsheba and then had her husband murdered to cover it up, it was the prophet Nathan that went to David and to confront him on behalf of God for what he had done. So that is really the role. Sometimes they spoke to kings, but they often just simply talked to the people. And we see that in Isaiah. He talks to both kings and to the people of, in that case, Judah. But that's not what Daniel does. He does not speak to any of the kings because they're all, he's living in Babylon. And he's not really addressing the Jewish people. In fact, his main audience in Daniel is really Gentile nations. So a very, very unique book. Daniel also is unique in that it's not all written in Hebrew. So all the rest of the books are written in Hebrew in the Old Testament. Yet Daniel, only the first chapter and then first 3 verses of chapter 2, along with chapters 8 through 12 are in Hebrew. But the heart of Daniel, and that would be chapters 2 through 7, are actually written in Aramaic. And why is that? Daniel, a direction of God, wants the Gentile nations to read this. Why? Because it's going to show that Yahweh God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is sovereign over the kings and the kingdoms of the world. Let's look at a little background here. And when we open up in chapter 1 of Daniel, it is 605 BC, or roughly thereafter. We see Daniel, and he is a teenager, perhaps an older teenager. This book now continues until we get into chapter 12, the last chapter of Daniel. And at that point, Daniel is now probably 88, 87 years old. So a good 70 years passes between chapter 1 and the last chapter of Daniel. And he spends that entire time in Babylon. So Daniel is really talking about things that Isaiah and Moses have already brought up. Remember when we were in Isaiah, I said, Isaiah is prophesying to the people, telling them to repent because they're breaking the covenant. And it's not a new thing. And remember we said he's taking all his cues from actually the book of Deuteronomy. Once again, Moses had brought the people out of Egypt, and they went to Mount Sinai, also called Mount Horeb, and they promised to be God's covenant, contract people. And God gave them the law, which they were supposed to follow. And of course, they rebelled. And they rebelled so much that God just said, fine, you're not going into the promised land. And they wander around in a big circle for 40 years. But at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, when they first had left Egypt, and God came down to them, they all agreed that they would be bound by the contract, the covenant. So now 40 years passes, and they are about to go into the promised land. Moses is 120. God says, you're not going to take them in. You will die soon, and Joshua will take the people in. But that older generation had passed, and their children and grandchildren had grown up to take their place. And so Moses once again wants that new generation to commit to the covenant with God. And he sets all this out in the book of Deuteronomy. So he would have written that at the end of Exodus, probably in about 1406 BC. He writes very clearly in Deuteronomy. You can read the book of Deuteronomy and you can get really all the high points of what happened during the Exodus. And then we get to the end, and the new generation commits to the covenant. And this time, Moses, at God's direction, includes blessings and curses. If you follow the covenant, you will be blessed. If you violate the covenant, the contract, then we will have what I'm going to call is progressive discipline. But Moses calls them curses. They start out and, well, let's talk about the law of Moses. So the law, I believe, has 628 different rules or laws in the law of Moses. We typically only pay attention to the first 10, the 10 commandments. But we see in the law of Moses things like honor the Lord your God, have no other gods before him, don't worship idols, don't take his name in vain. There should be justice and equity for all people. We don't have one law for the rich and one law for the poor. And so these are the kinds of things in the law. Well, from the very beginning, everybody was breaking them. So this time around, Moses makes sure they understand there will be punishment, these curses, if you continue. And Isaiah talked about that. This stuff is coming. Well, now we get to Daniel, and it's here. This progressive discipline starts out, well, maybe we'll have a drought. Maybe the animals won't be reproducing. Maybe you're not going to have children. But little by little, if you don't turn, then the worst thing that's going to happen to you is the nation will be destroyed. An enemy will come in, break down the walls, destroy the temple, and kill most of the people and take a remnant into captivity. Well, that's exactly the background of Daniel, and he is the first wave of those taken into captivity. As always, God is very gracious, slow to anger. He gives them so many chances. And yet we know from the book of Ezekiel is one of the captives in the second round of deportation, and we'll talk about that. And God shows him in a vision how corrupt the priests were. How they were worshiping other gods. This is the priests back in Jerusalem, and how the people were engaged in pedophilia and just these horrible things. So it was clear that people were breaking the covenant, and it kept getting worse and worse. God, though, does not have this invasion and deportation happen all at once. It happens over a period of 20 years. The first one is in 605 BC. Now, let's do a little history background here. 605 BC, one of the most important critical battles in all of ancient history happened. It's the Battle of Carchemish. It's in that battle that these upstart Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar was the son of the king and he was the general, is able to defeat the Egyptians at a place called Carchemish. And that changes history. Because from this point on, Egyptians are no longer a superpower. They now are eclipsed into second-class status. And Babylon becomes ascendant. Within that year, the general, Nebuchadnezzar, decides after he beats the Egyptians, he goes all through the Middle East there. Anybody who was favorable or tried to help the Egyptians, including Judah, he went in and chastised them. So in the case of Judah, he goes into Jerusalem, knocks on the door, breaks in, takes all kinds of gold and silver and sacred vessels from the temple, just robs them blind. And he takes hostages. He takes the sons of nobility and the royalty, the king's family himself. He takes them as hostages into Babylon as a way of telling all these people groups, you don't support Egypt, you support us now. Daniel is one of those young men, and he tells us that in chapter 1. And some of the young men are because they're good looking, there's no blemish, there's no problems, they're smart, they are selected for special service in the king's, palace. And that's who Daniel is. The king is replaced in Judah at that time. A new king is placed by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, his father, dies within the year, and so he's now king, and he remains king for 57 years. And the new king that is installed by Nebuchadnezzar is expected to be a vassal and to be loyal to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. But by and by, he rebels. So Nebuchadnezzar, this is now 597. So this is 8 years later, the new king has rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar goes back to Jerusalem, knocks on the door. He takes the king, the king's mother, and he takes as hostages the important people in Judah. So he would have taken officers. He did take people who were skilled, maybe a goldsmith, a silversmith, people who could provide skills there in Babylon. And he basically left, the people that nobody wanted. Of that second group of people that are seized is a guy named Ezekiel. When he gets to Babylon, he is called at that point to be a prophet. And so Ezekiel, very, very detailed set of prophecies during this time. Now you think after these two deportations that the now new king would have got the idea that, I need to be loyal to Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, the prophet Jeremiah got in trouble because he kept saying, don't go to Egypt, you must stay loyal to Nebuchadnezzar. And he's imprisoned and all kinds of things happen to Jeremiah because of what his warnings are. But they don't. And so they rebel now again. And this is the year 586. And Nebuchadnezzar said, 3 strikes and you're out, boys. This time, we're not taking hostages. We're not going to steal your silver and your gold. We're going to destroy your nation. So he goes marching into the capital city of Jerusalem, breaks down the walls. They destroy and burn the temple. They kill most of the people and take a remnant back to Babylon. They leave practically nothing. Okay, only the homeless people are left. So we see God's really gracious hand. He's trying to discipline them. They continue to break the covenant. And so that's the background of all of Daniel. Now let's talk about the narrative. Chapter 1, which is about Daniel, is really not part of the narrative. It's sort of an introduction. Today, if you you got a book, all this stuff about Daniel would be in the preface or an introduction. The story really starts in chapter 2, and it goes through chapter 7. It's in Aramaic. Daniel wants the Gentiles to read this. That shows God's sovereignty over the kings and kingdoms of the world. And then he picks up in 8 through 12, and he's back in Hebrew. The curious thing about Daniel is he doesn't really get his first vision until he's about 70. And for about the next 17 years, he gets 4 visions. In addition to these 4 visions, there are 2 dreams of Nebuchadnezzar. The first dream of Nebuchadnezzar, we'll read about that in chapter 2, is a vision of time. What is going to happen to the kingdoms of the world from Nebuchadnezzar until the end of time? And that story is essentially what all the other 5 things are about. Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we use some metaphors and some symbols, and he sets out the general grand scheme of history between the time of Nebuchadnezzar and the end of time. We get to the second dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and it's really about him and his humbling, but how he fits in at the end of his time. We got those 2 dreams. Then we come up in chapters 7 through 12, and we get these 4 visions. The vision in 7 is really the same story as Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but there are more details. And in fact, each of the successive visions cover parts or all of that same period of time, but they just give greater detail. And so by and large, the last 3 visions give very detailed information as it affects the people of Israel, or the people of Judah, the Jews. Now, there are some things in there that we as evangelical Christians find interesting, like the 77s of weeks and some of that. Not going to get into that too much, but that's sort of the big overview of Daniel. Now, so the narrative itself, well, before we get to the narrative, I do want to talk about Daniel, and I should have done this earlier. Why is chapter 1 there? Daniel is a young man, and because he's good looking and he's talented and he's smart, he's chosen with several others, and he is turned over to who? Well, some of your translations, which are politically correct, will say an official of the king. Well, the actual underlying Hebrew here is chief of the eunuch, as in men who are castrated. A lot of controversy here, but really when you look at it, you can only come to one conclusion. In ancient times, and certainly in Oriental kingdoms, of which this would have been one, it was a very, very common practice. And it continued in many civilizations right up until the last few hundred years. If you got selected as a slave, servant, whatever, to work in the palace, the king wanted to make sure that there wasn't any temptation for you. And so it was the common practice that slaves who went to work were castrated. A lot of people don't like that, but it's there. And let me show you. Daniel, for his entire 70 years that he is there, plus, he, he's not married, he has no family, and he's always living in the palace. Even after the Persians invade and defeat the Babylonian Empire and take over the palace, Daniel's continued. He's still allowed to live there. Why? Because he's a eunuch. And now people will say, well, that's not really fair, except that's what Scripture says. In 2 Kings chapter 20, we read how King Hezekiah was showing off to the Babylonians. This would have been before Nebuchadnezzar. And he was showing them all the wealth that he had in his palace and in his temple. And this is one of the reasons why when Nebuchadnezzar came, he seized a lot, because they knew there was a lot of treasure there. God was upset. He sent the prophet to Hezekiah and said, why did you do that? That was poor wisdom on your part. And then the prophet says, your descendants, your own flesh and blood, will be taken away and become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Friends, that's what Scripture says. Now, I want us to think about what's going on here. I don't know how many young men were taken. I'm going to say older teenagers. We know of only 4, Daniel and his 3 friends, who were given Babylonian names, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And we'll talk about them in a minute or two. And they, at Daniel's urging, try to be faithful to God. Let's think that through. So Daniel is, before he gets to Babylon, he's in Jerusalem. He's probably his great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather was Hezekiah. So, he's got a good life, go to private school. He's probably on his iPad or iPhone talking to his girlfriend, and then his father or grandfather comes in and says, Daniel, come with me. Daniel's taken to the palace, and there are all these other young men there. And the king says to these young men, you see all those buses out there with Babylonian drivers? Get on the bus. They get a long bus ride to Babylon. And they get there. Some of them are sorted out to work at the palace. And then something that neither Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, or Abednego could possibly have imagined. It is the worst day of their life. A lot of people did not survive castration, but obviously they did not have pain-killing drugs. This was a horrible experience. Obviously, you'd have post-traumatic stress after something like that, and they're not expecting that. Now, within a day or two, all you can do is be angry, and you're so filled with anger for what has happened to you. And then as days, a couple weeks pass by, and all those hormones go away, the anger goes, and you fall into a deep depression because your life is over. Daniel and his friends, let's say a couple weeks later, a mistake is made, you can all go home. They would not have been able to go home. Under the law of Moses, a eunuch cannot inherit property. You are considered dead to your family. Your family is not going to take you back. Daniel is still alive when they are allowed to go back into the promised land. He doesn't, because he can't. Well, maybe he could go and, if he lived long enough, he could worship at the new temple. No, he can't. A eunuch was not allowed to participate in the worship in the temple. Everything in his life is taken away, never to be returned. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't go into a deep depression funk. He carries on. And the first test is, will you eat food that's kosher, honoring to God, or will you eat the stuff the Babylonians? Well, clearly all the other young men could care less about the law of Moses at that point, because they weren't even covered by the law of Moses, really, after they became eunuchs. But Daniel says we are going to honor and worship God, and he convinces 3 of his friends, and they are honored, and God does honor them. Why is that in the story? Well, we see as we go through the story that oftentimes when the angel comes to speak to Daniel, he says things like, highly esteemed of God. God allowed this horrible, horrible, horrible thing to happen to Daniel and his friends. And they chose to continue to honor God. No, nobody else did. And could you blame them? This is a story a lot like Job. God allows these things to happen to Job, and in the end, he never tells him why. He just says, yeah, Job, these things happened. Will you still honor, love, and worship me? That's the point of Job. Yeah, these things happen to you. Will you still love and honor and worship me? Now, this is a hard teaching for many of our younger people because you've grown up in a church that says God is always on your side. God is always going to take care of you. He's always going to fix everything. Friends, God is going to allow things to happen in your life that are not going to be happy days. And God willing, none of that will happen to you like Daniel. But in this world, we will have trouble. And Daniel chose to be honoring to God, and God blessed him every single time after that. And so this was quite a test, and that's why it's there. That is why God is using Daniel, because Daniel singularly, steps out. By the way, there was some archaeology done in Babylon. At some point, they uncovered, I'm sure, late 1800s, early 1900s, the library of Nebuchadnezzar, and it's only been in the recent decades they've been able to translate a lot of this stuff. They've actually found a record, and I can't remember which of the 3 young men it is. I want to say it's Meshach, could have been Abednego, where he is appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, same name, to be the person in charge of the dancing girls and the prostitutes in the city of Babylon. If he was a eunuch, obviously he would not be distracted as he managed the prostitutes and the dancing girls. So, once again, this has happened, and Daniel rises above that. This, though, is a story for the Jews. The Gentiles don't care. But now we get to the actual narrative, and this is the story. Again, chapters 8 through 12 are an appendix. They're really one continuous explanation of Daniel's first vision, really. All right. Daniel writes in a chiasm. We've touched on chiasms before. We typically see chiasms used in poetry and in psalms. Psalms, of course, are poetry set to music. Once again, the main point is in the middle. So let's say you have a psalm or a poetry. You've got 7 lines. The first line and the last line, in my example, first and 7th verse or line, will say essentially the same thing. And they'll point to the middle. The second verse and the second to the last verse, in my case, verses 2 and 6, will also say parallel or similar things. Different from 1 and 7, but 2 and 6 will be very similar, and they too will point inward. And then when we get to the 3rd verse and the third from the last, which in my case would be 3 and 5, they too are parallel and say similar things, and again point to the middle. And that leaves us with one verse, the very central part. And in my example, that's verse 4. And verse 4 would be the main point that the author wants to make. And the three sets of parallel verses would all point towards that middle. We don't write like that. So Daniel is interesting. He uses the chiastic way as he's writing prose. We typically see it, though, in poetry. In this case, what's in Aramaic, the chiasm, chapter 2 and chapter 7 are visions of time. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. He won't tell anybody what it is, but it's something that disturbs him greatly. He understands it's important. And the only one who can translate, of course, interpret it is Daniel. And it's a vision of time. And Nebuchadnezzar sees a great statue. It's got a head of gold, a chest of silver. Its thighs are bronze. Its legs are iron, and its toes are iron mixed with clay. At some point, a hand, not a human hand, carves a rock out of a mountain, throws it at the statue. The statue is busted up into little pieces, and it turns into chaff and is blown away in the wind. And that rock grows and grows and fills the entire world. And of course, Daniel explains the head of gold is Babylon, and in particular Nebuchadnezzar. And then he will be replaced by the Medes and Persian, and that's the silver. And they will be replaced by, actually, it's Alexander the Great and his four great generals, and that's the Greeks, and that's the bronze. And then, of course, the Greek culture is finally conquered by the Romans, and that represents the iron. And you say, you said that's to the end of time. Where are we? Well, we are the toes, the iron and the clay mixed together. Now, Daniel doesn't spend a lot of time other than to say this rock, which is going to destroy all the human civilizations, is going to grow and basically rule for the end of time. Now, we go to the parallel vision, and that's in chapter 7. So Daniel this is now actually after the time of the Babylonians. This is the early part where the Medes and Persians have conquered the Babylonians. Daniel is about 70, and this is when he has his first vision. And he has a vision which uses different symbols, different metaphors to say the same thing. But for him, it's these mythological beasts. He sees a lion with wings. The wings are torn off, and the lion is stood on its feet, and it becomes a man. And this is Nebuchadnezzar. And then there is a bear, and the description of the bear fits with the Medes and Persians. And then there's a leopard with four wings on its back, and that, of course, is Alexander the Great, and the four wings are the four generals that carve up his empire after he dies. And then finally, there is a mythological creature that is so horrifying that Daniel can't even describe him, other than to say that it's frightening and that it basically chews everything up. Again, similar to what Nebuchadnezzar had, but this time we have more information. This time, Daniel is told that this rock is actually the one like a son of man who comes with the clouds. And I'm going to go back and go through this in detail. And is given all dominion. And this all dominion, and he's worshipped by all people. And it's an everlasting king. And that is clearly the Christ. So those are the two visions that point to the middle. Now, what we can tell, the God, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is sovereign over time. All time, human history is going to unfold how God planned it. We'll take just a second. If you were on the outside looking in after 586 BC, you would say, this Yahweh God isn't very strong. I mean, he couldn't keep his people from being destroyed and carried into captivity by this Nebuchadnezzar guy. If you were a Jew on the outside or on the inside looking around, you'd say, well, God wasn't very strong. These two visions tell us, no, no, no. What happened to the Jews is exactly what God wanted to happen to them, vis-a-vis the promises in Deuteronomy. You broke the covenant. You worshiped other gods. You got involved in pedophilia. You treated poor people terribly. You did not pay your workers a full wage. You broke the covenant over and over. And so things are unfolding exactly how I planned them. God is sovereign over human history and the unfolding of time to the end of time. All right. Let's now go to the next two parallel lines. This is chapter 3. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar, after he's had that dream, builds this giant statue, and he's got it covered with, gold and silver and that stuff to represent his dream, and he wants all people to worship it. Well, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego says, we're not going to do that. Nebuchadnezzar is furious, and they won't worship the idol. They choose to worship Yahweh God, and him only, and to keep the covenant the best they can. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar, there's these furnaces for all the smelting. They pump them up real hot. And he commands his people to throw the three, Hebrew youth into the fire. We're told that the fire is so hot that the men throwing the three into the furnace are killed by the heat. And Nebuchadnezzar is standing there watching. He looks in the door and he's like, uh-oh. There are not three burned up bodies in this terrible fire. He sees not three, but 4 people walking among the flames and are not being burnt. Okay, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego come out. And they come out, and they're not even singed, and they don't smell smoky. Now, what happens next is just classic how smart Nebuchadnezzar is. Nebuchadnezzar's like, oh, I have misjudged the God Yahweh. This God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego is so powerful that he can keep them from being killed in the furnace. He can frustrate what I want to do here. And Nebuchadnezzar then puts out a decree to go to his whole empire that says, nobody can say a bad word against the God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Now, is he saying he believes Yahweh God and only him? No, not at all. But he's a smart guy, and he realizes, okay, I'm in Babylon. I worship Marduk. We'll come back to Marduk. And these guys are from Jerusalem, and somehow their God's taken along, and he's going to protect them. I want to make sure that I don't get cross with Yahweh God, so I'm going to decree to everybody that they need to be nice to Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and of course they get promotions. So this is a tale of deliverance, where God delivers his from a king. God could have delivered his people from Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, but he chose not to. The point is, he can. One more time, history is unfolding as he wrote it before the beginning of the world. Now, the parallel story is now chapter 6. The Babylonians have come and gone. The Medes are in power. And for the life of me, Daniel's in his 80s. He's still living in a palace, and he is promoted to one of the top 3 civil administrators in the empire. And he's not even a Mede or a Persian. Well, obviously, by this time, like I said, he's in his 80s. He's got a lot of credibility. The Mede and Persian emperor king, who is Cyrus, is not as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar was. And he is tricked, or if it's not Cyrus, it's the person who is running Babylon. There's some debate there. So Cyrus is certainly the king of the Persians. We see, though, in Scripture the use of Darius. It's believed that Darius was the Mede title. So, in fact, it is Cyrus. Cyrus' father had the right, was to the throne of the Persians, and we understand his mother had the right or was in the line to the king of the Medes. And so when the two of them got together, obviously Cyrus got the whole ball of wax. All right. At any rate, these evil people who are administrators, who are Persians and Medes, want to get Daniel. So they trick the king, the Persian king, they force his hand. And I won't go into the whole story, but his hand is forced and he can't change what he has just decreed. And so because Daniel prayed to God and somebody saw him, several people, and he wasn't supposed to, he is thrown into the lion's den. Now, the Persians love lions. There were a lot of motifs in their palaces and walls. And so they would keep lions in a big den, very deep. And that's how they killed people. You got thrown into the lion's den, and hungry lions, they would gobble up the people that were thrown there. And so Daniel's thrown into the lion's den. The guy says he's in his 80s. And the Persian king realized he's been tricked, but he can't change anything, at least not yet. All night long, he doesn't sleep, he doesn't eat, he's just worried because he's got it figured out. This God of Daniel is not somebody you should take lightly. In the morning, he gets up, he goes to the lion's den, remove the stone or whatever, and he calls down, "Daniel, are you there?" And Daniel's down there petting the cats. And Daniel's, yeah. God's angel just shut the mouths of these lions. So the Persian king I was right. His God is really powerful. And so he has Daniel pulled out of the lion's den, and he too sends out a decree to all of his kingdom, praising Daniel's God. The people who trick the king are thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children, and the lions devour them before their bodies hit the floor. So we have now a parallel story of deliverance. God could protect his man, Daniel, who's 80 years old, sitting down among all these lions. He could very easily have protected the Jews in Jerusalem in 586, but he decreed that they should go through it. In fact, he decreed that before the beginning of the world. Gentiles need to get this. God has planned all of human history before there was any. God can deliver his people, and it doesn't matter the kingdom or the empire or who the king is. It doesn't matter what the situation. God is more powerful than the most powerful person in these kingdoms.
You've been listening to Daniel Part 1. Tune in next week for Part 2. Thank you for joining us on Biblical Reflections today. We hope you've enjoyed this episode as a part of our Gospel Truth series. If you have any questions or thoughts about the gospel or salvation, feel free to contact us through email at station@cogworksmedia or by visiting our website at cogworksmedia.org. Biblical Reflections is a proud production of Cogworks Media, where we strive to bring you life-changing programs and stories from Christ followers around the world. We invite you to explore our website at cogworksmedia.org to discover new content added every month. Cogworks Media is a nonprofit ministry that relies on the generosity of listeners like you. If you've been blessed by our programs and would like to support our mission, please consider giving securely online at cogworksmedia.org. Thank you for your continued support, and we look forward to having you join us for more inspiring episodes of Biblical Reflections.